to go with Miss Carrie today to Kids Club. And adults, I'm here again. We're glad you're here this morning. Whether this is your first time or whether this is your church home, we're glad you're here. We're glad if you're joining us in person, but we're also glad if you're joining us online. And we want to say welcome. Welcome to our church. We are in week 2 of a series that we're calling Alter Ego. And we've talked about those 2 words, altar, the place where I lay everything down, this place of humility that oftentimes we skip over in a church. In fact, there are many churches that they have taken the altar out altogether. And I think to myself, there's a real danger in that because it makes the statement that it's not important. And I understand the mindset of, well, but that's the old ways. But we have to come to grips with the idea that there will come a time in our life where every knee will bow. I think about this idea of ego. How many of you spend time on social media at all? You can see some people's egos, right? Doesn't take long, does it? We live in a society that is driven by this idea of ego. I'm going to get mine, right? Everybody needs to go get theirs. There's this thought process that I'm the man. Football drives that a little bit, doesn't it? Sports mindset, guys. Any sports guys? It does drive it, doesn't it? That competitive edge. It tells us that if I make a good play, I'm somehow a little better than the guy across from me. And I'm not saying that there's something wrong with that. I am saying that it can be overdone. Last week we talked about laying at the altar some of our feelings of inadequacy, and I hope and I pray that as you've gone through the week, you've processed a little bit of like, God, where are my inadequacies being brought up from? And you heard me talk last week, we were going to talk about control. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. This need to lay down our need for control. How many of you would say that occasionally you're just a little bit of a control freak? In fact, just reach over and grab somebody else's hand and raise it up for, Go ahead, let's see it. Yeah, see, that's really what that control thing is, right? We need to control it. Here, put your hand up. Anybody feel like that? Sometimes you've got to own it. As a pastor, over the years, early on, I had a pastor friend who said to me, because he realized that I would be this way, and he realized I would be this way because I'm wired a lot like him, and he's wired this way. He said, Michael, at some point you're going to have to come to grips with this idea that occasionally you're going to have to learn to practice the principle of good enough. And I'm sure Pastor Dave could probably speak to the idea that there have been times in ministry where you really want to make something happen and you think to yourself, I'm going to do it. We're going to make this happen. But he made the statement to me, he said, listen, if there's somebody else that can do it half as good as you need to hand it over and let them do it half as good as you. Because you can't do everything. You can't control everything. Ooh. At first, I didn't know what he was talking about, but the longer I've gone on, sometimes there have been moments in my life that I realized, because the Holy Spirit has stuck that little jab in me and said, you're doing it again, that I have to hand those little pieces over and go, Okay, God. All right. I can't control everything. Some of us, we try to control everything, don't we? The house has to be just right. The dishes, oh, no, let's not do dishes. Let's do laundry, ladies. You're not folding them right. Guys, I don't fold laundry anymore. At my house, my wife has let me know that I do it incorrectly. And so I've said, out of the graciousness of my heart, well then, sweetheart, you can do it. And she actually shook her head in agreement. She agrees. I don't fold the laundry right? Yeah, she says, you can fold your own laundry. I don't care. I may have just landed in the doghouse. There's that need for us to control certain things in our life. Maybe it's your finances. Maybe you're the person in your household that takes care of the finances, and you're like, just all eyes off, don't mess with it. You tell me every cent you're going to spend. I need all your receipts. Maybe it's work stuff that we try to control. Anybody try to control work stuff? Business owner Dwayne over there shaking his head. You know why? Because when you're a business owner, it really matters, doesn't it? Every little nail costs you something, doesn't it? And it's important. You think I've got to control this. And unfortunately, sometimes that need for control, it turns into sort of this freakish control, right? We call these people narcissists. They begin to try to control everything around them, and everything has to revolve around their need for control. They're the kind of people that will look at you and they'll tell you the 1 to 2 things that really bother them about you. They're the kind of people that the circumstances bother them. They think about how they look, how things are going to look to them outside. And listen, the reality is, if you look to the person next to you, I bet you know and they know that occasionally you both struggle there just a little bit. That need for control. Look at the person next to you and say, you know what, you struggle. It's okay. It's okay. Tell them. I got some shaking heads. You struggle with it, don't you? It's a reality. And, you know, the second I said the need for control, I saw eyes looking at each other like, you know what you struggle with in the areas of control. You just do. My wife could tell you probably 10 things that I always want to control, and it probably drives her nuts. I could tell you the few things that she wants to control, and it probably drives me nuts. It's a part of our lives, whether we like it or we don't. And what I'm here to tell you this morning is that when we try to control, when Michael tries to control, I'm making a statement with my ego. I'm making a statement with my ego that says, you know what? I know best. Listen to me. This is how this is going to go. I know best. But the truth is, in that moment, me knowing best is edging God out of the picture, isn't it? One of my favorite verses, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. I'm going to read from the Michael's abridged version this morning. It says, in that moment, trust in the Lord with some of your heart and lean on your own understanding. In some of your ways, acknowledge him, and you will make your path straight. That's what I'm saying when I say, I have to have it my way. Think about it. Anybody meet somebody ever that they needed to be so in control that when something went wrong, they just went berserk? They lost their marbles? My first boss was that way. Something would go wrong and he would fly off the handle. He would belittle everybody in the store. Just, this is your fault. You do that again, you're getting fired. And I think to myself, he'd have been so much happier if he'd have realized that, you know what? Sometimes there are some things that are outside of our control. His workers would have been so much happier if they would have realized that, you know what? Sometimes there are some things that are just outside of our control. And we work on those things, but we don't always have to be the ones in control. For some of us, the more that we try to control, the more we become afraid of losing control. And that's usually what leads to that mindset of blowing up. And the more we're afraid, the more we try to control. And it creates this vicious cycle. It's control gone bad. And the thing that I found is that when I get into that cycle, I have to stop and I have to look in the mirror and I have to ask God, what is it that you want me to do? What is it you want from me? As I was thinking this week about biblical examples of people that kind of want to control things, the best story I could think of comes from Genesis chapter 16. And in the story, we see Abram and we see Sarai, his wife. And it reads like this. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. But she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. Now the story goes like this. She winds up having Hagar a little boy by the name of Ishmael. This is Abram, who later we begin to call Abraham. Abraham, the father of the nations. Abraham, who God promised that his descendants would be like unto the stars in the sky. Abraham, who God made a covenant with that Jesus would come through his descendants. Abraham, who God asked, "Will you trust me?" And here we see Abram and Sarah saying, "God, I got to be honest. I don't trust your plan, so we're going to do it our way," right? Now, if we look at history, we find that God does come through on his promise, right? If you remember, in her old age, round about the age of 90 plus, Sarah gives birth to who? Anybody? Isaac. Good job. You're with me still. Sarah gives birth to Isaac. This is after God has said, no, you're going to have a child. In fact, Sarah laughs when she hears it because she's thinking to herself, I'm well beyond the childbearing years. But Sarah winds up giving birth to Isaac. The ultimate switch, God's way, our way. Isaac being the father of Jacob. Isaac being the line of David, who brings about later the birth of Christ. Ishmael, the opposite, right? Through which the Muslim line now flows. The two brothers wind up rift, right? History shows now you've got the Israelites and the Arabs, and they fight. When we try to take control of things, we have a propensity to mess them up. It sounds great on paper at first, doesn't it? If I control this, it'll be fine. But the longer you control it, the more out of hand it gets. And it begs a question. What in your life are you trying to control that you need to hand over? What in your life are you trying to control that you need to hand over, that you need to lay at the altar? Is it your kids? Is it your schedule? Is it your coworkers? Something from your job? What is it? As we begin to lay those things at the altar, we have to acknowledge that there are some steps that we have to take. And we have to acknowledge that there are some scales that have to weigh, right? Because there are some things that God has entrusted to us in stewardship for us to take care of. But I believe that there are some questions that we can begin to ask ourselves. The first question is this. If there's something that I'm trying to control, is it worth my concern? Is it worth my concern? Luke chapter 10, verses 41 and 42 says, we get into the story where Mary and Martha have Jesus over at their house, and Jesus says to Martha, who's very upset that Mary has been doing Jesus things, right? She's sitting at the feet of Jesus. She's spending time with Jesus. And Martha, not that she's doing bad, she wants everything to go very well. Martha's probably the one who sets out the fine china, right? She's the one who, like, everything has, the flowers have to be perfect on the table. The carpet had to be vacuumed like 8 times to her liking, all the little stains and stuff. The kids are probably all dressed in their best, right? The poor husband is like, sweetheart, if I have to dust the fans one more time, but she's going, no, I saw dust spots, you're going to do it again. And Jesus says this, Martha, Martha, you're worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. He's basically saying, listen, the dishes don't have to be done a certain way. It's okay today if you put out the plastics and the plasticware, because I'm here to spend time with you. So the question becomes, is it really worth my concern? The answer sometimes is yes, it is. Okay, I want to be clear about that. The answer sometimes is yes, it is. But oftentimes we stress about things we have no reason to stress about. And we need to hand those things over. There are just some things you cannot control. Let it, in the words of Elsa, let it go. The second thing that I think that you have to come to grips with, the second question is this: is it mine to control? I told you just a second ago that I believe that God gives us some things that he does desire for us to control. Amen? There are bits of stewardship that are important, and Scripture is clear about what those things are. There is much expected amongst those of us who much is given. How many of you would say, I'm blessed, Pastor? Many. I'm blessed, right? God has given me exceedingly abundantly, whether it's with my finances, whether it's with my family, whether it's with relationships and friends. You do realize that riches can be way, way deeper than just monetary, right? And you do realize that there is a stewardship to relationship, isn't there? And that there's a responsibility that weighs on each of us. But be careful with this idea of control. Am I controlling my friends and my family? Am I controlling my finances? Or am I stewarding my friends and my family? Am I doing the things that I know I need to do to continue to build the relationships? Am I doing the things that I know I need to do to continue to grow the blessings that God has given me? Or am I holding on to them so tightly that I'm choking them out? Is it mine to control? James chapter 4, verses 13 and 14 says this: Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Verse 14, why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. Sometimes we make plans. I remember as a kid, I used to love going to state youth convention. Now, I grew up in Southwest Kansas, and so our state youth convention was always Thanksgiving weekend, okay? So we would have Thanksgiving Day, and then Friday morning we would leave, and we would drive halfway across the state because state youth convention was always in the center of the state. It was always in this one hotel in Hutchinson, Kansas. Now, the great thing about Kansas is it's flat and it's easy to get around. The bad thing about Kansas is it's flat and the wind blows, and when it snows, it can get really, really nasty. And I remember being so excited to go to state youth convention, and I woke up Thanksgiving morning, and wouldn't you know it, a blizzard had blown in over the Rockies. I had been planning, I had been saving, I had worked car washes, I had done cookie sales, I had done everything they asked me to do to try to earn my way to be able to go to state youth convention. And do you know how crushed I was when we got 18 inches of snow? Well, 18 inches of snow is a lot of snow, okay? But in Kansas, 18 inches of snow plus wind equals drifts, equals road closures, equals we ain't going to state youth convention this year. And I remember being so upset. But the reality is sometimes you can't control what you can't control, right? Why am I upset about this? Needs to be the question sometimes. Anybody ever get upset about something you can't control? To the stage, you're just like, what's going on? If you get to that stage, the question that you have to ask in the first place is, was it even mine to control in the first place? And I think, unfortunately, you're often going to find that the answer is probably wasn't. Right? You don't even know what will happen tomorrow. I remember a few times dealing with my kids with this, getting them to understand when we're disappointed, we can lay the plans out, can't we? But sometimes things aren't going to go my way. It's not even mine to control. The third thing that I think we have to ask ourselves is this, and I think it's the most important question amongst all of these questions. Is my need, is this thing, is it for God alone, or is it tainted because of me, because of what I want? Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7 says, "Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." When we start trying to control things that we can't, we get anxious, don't we? I believe wholeheartedly that right now in this world that we struggle so much with anxiety. I don't believe that. Studies show it. This is the most anxious time in history. We have teenagers having nervous breakdowns. And part of it is because we put so much pressure on them. Everything's about a test, a test, a test. Everything's about success. Oh, you got to be successful. You got to go to school so you got to go straight A's so that you can get the best job. We got to make sure that you go to school, get straight A's, then so you can go to school and get straight A's. Oh, and by the way, when you step on the baseball field, you got to be the best of the best because we need you to get a scholarship so that we can pay for the school that you got to go to so that maybe one day you can be a pro athlete and maybe then you'll have enough money, but you'll still need the degree because if you don't have the degree, Lord knows you might blow out your knee or your shoulder, and then your life's you're going to be on the street. That's how it's going to go. And I think to myself, it's no wonder these kids are like on Xanax. I mean, you got colleges trying to give scholarships to 12-year-olds. I didn't know what I wanted to be at 12. That's pressure. It's no wonder that everybody's anxious and depressed. And it starts here. You got to do well on the test. You got to score good. The best way I know to give up anxiety is to just give it to God and say, God, in this moment, I need peace. I can't breathe. I'm struggling. Lord, you know that I'm so keyed up right now. I'm itching. I got hives from all this stress. We have to start looking at things differently. And when we approach him and his throne, we have to start asking questions differently. But sometimes when we're giving these things up, it can't be, God, can you change my spouse? It needs to be, God, can you change me and my heart and work on their heart? Because I have to acknowledge that this relationship thing's two ways. It can't be, God, what can I do to fix this problem? It needs to be, God, can you help me let go of it so that you can fix it? Because I can't do this anymore. It can't be, God, show me what I can do to control my future. It needs to be at the altar, on our knees, saying, God, I don't know what the future holds, but I know that you do. And so, God, will you, can you help me? Can you bring about a change in this moment in me? Will you take it from me? There's a million things that we wish we could control. One of the things that always hits me, it's always the first place we go is to our knees when it's a health crisis, right? Because there's a reality there that says, I can't heal me. What if we treated the rest of life that way? What if we said, you know what, God? I can't control the finances. I know you can. God, it's yours in the first place. Abraham's story. Later in Abraham's life, Isaac is a little bit older. And God tests Abraham. He says, Abraham, do you love me? Abraham's like, yeah, I love you, Lord. You know that I will follow you. I trust you. Lord says, I got just the question for you. That son of yours, you know the one I gave you, the one that you love so much? Yeah, Lord. Will you sacrifice him for me? Well, Lord, do you mean like I give it to you? I mean, he's yours if you... No. I mean, are you willing to sacrifice him at the altar? Are you willing to lay him down, lay his life down for me? There's this... I can't imagine as a father the whole process there. But what we find is that Abraham is actually willing. He searches himself and he says, you know what, I'm going to do that. I have to do that. He takes Isaac up to the mountain. And he's still, I'm sure, broken and crying and praying and saying, God, please, God, this isn't what I want, but I'm willing out of obedience to follow you. And what we find is when we're obedient in this story, Genesis chapter 22, verses 13 and 14, God provided a sacrifice in the form of a ram. It says Abram went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And I love this. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. Listen, I believe wholeheartedly that sometimes God is calling us and asking us the same kinds of questions. Are you willing to be obedient to me? Are you willing to hand it over? Can you let that go and let me take it? God, I can't possibly, I've got to, no, let it go. It doesn't belong to you. Why are you worried about it? And when we're willing to come to the altar and say, Lord, it's yours. He provides what we needed and then some. And my hope is that if you find yourself in that sort of a spot, that you'll be able to look back in the rearview mirror of life and remember that moment and look at it and say, I call that chapter, that place, that moment, the Lord will provide. So that when the next storm comes and there's one more thing that you need to hand over, it's so much easier because you go, you know what, I remember this the last time I looked in the rearview mirror, there's that place called the Lord will provide. I'm just going to take it there. I'm just going to lay it there on the altar, and I'm going to trust that God's going to take it. And let me encourage you, the more often you do that, faith is a funny thing. It grows the more you exercise it. So that when we look at each other in the eye and you have these conversations, you've got this confidence about you that is not the confidence that says, I controlled it, I got it there. It's the confidence that says, you know what? I trust that my God has this, and I don't have to worry about it. And you can say it with confidence in a way that somebody else knows the peace that you've already experienced. Our words are important. The way we act is important. Parents, you have these conversations with your kids, don't you? The way we act is important. I don't want you acting like a spoiled brat. Parents, grandparents, sometimes we act like spoiled brats. Sometimes we need some of those same conversations, right? Let God be in control. Take the time. Listen, these altars, as much as anything, they're a symbol. Me laying self down, sacrificing self on the altar, it doesn't have to happen here. It can happen on your couch at home if that's where God has the conversation with you, and that's the place to let it go. But your ego has to die if you're ever to be exactly what He wants you to be. He, not me. I'm going to do the uncomfortable thing, and that is this. I'm going to leave the altars open. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to just play the guitar. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. If there's something that you need to come and you need to lay down this morning, I want to welcome you. Come. You don't have to be anxious. You don't have to be worried. You don't have to be the one in control anymore.